Good morning, good time of day, folks. Thank you for joining us for our post COP29 reflection call. I have some of my fiercest friends and colleagues here with me who were also on the ground in COP to just share some immediate feedback and thoughts of what happened in this space. There's, I think, a lot of hot takes, a lot of media circulating around what the outcomes were. And hopefully, some of you, I know, were either at COP and were deeply engaged in that space, or you were hopefully following along some of those updates that happened. So, thanks for joining us and being witness to our feedback session and our reflections. This is, of course, a very quick feedback. I think that as a broader collective and network members, as members of the women and gender constituency, there will be a lot of reflection of what the outcomes of this particular COP were, and really how do we move forward from here. Um, but without further ado, and I haven't prepped you, Tara, that I was going to come to you first. So apologies for that. But I think that, a lot of folks um, are understanding and are coming from the framing that this was a finance COP and are really thinking about what these outcomes mean for us and for how will we move forward. Obviously, you are someone who has followed the issue of finance as a whole, of the new collective quantified goal for a number of years now. Um, and I think that there's some really strong feelings about what this outcome means. And so, hoping you could first and foremost break down for us how you and the women and gender constituency is feeling about this outcome, particularly around finance. Um, are there still alternatives? Are there still ways in which we could be doing advocacy around this? And then maybe we can come back and have more of a collective conversation about where we go from here. But could I ask you to kind of ground us a little bit in this big finance piece to start with?
Absolutely. So we at this COP were looking at the culmination of a 3-year process on having a series of technical expert dialogues, having so much conversation around what a new collective quantified goal could look like as first set forth in the Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of expectation coming into this COP that these years of conversations around the quality of finance, even though there had not been a quantity of finance put forth by developed countries coming into this COP, that there would be something that would be delivered that would really reflect this moment that we're in, reflect the global stock take last year, reflect the needs that have been quantified, for example, from the Standing Committee on Finance, its most recent second determination of needs reports, reflect the ambition that's clearly needed. And instead, the outcome that we ended up having has left many feeling a sense of betrayal, and I think a lack of trust that this process that was supposed to be based on needs, that this process that was supposed to be based on the science, was actually producing something that is going to deliver our roadmap for the next 10 years. So what was decided, this goal, and I use that term actually very loosely, because when we actually look at the quantified amount, the $300 billion, and we consider inflation, when we consider the real cost of climate inaction with every moment that we have delayed and will continue delaying, and when we consider all of the things that are being counted within this goal, which is not only grant money that is going to be given by developed countries, but also money that is mobilized by developed countries. including loans that are both concessional and market rate loans, also including the entirety of flows through the multilateral development banks that are climate finance, that are counted as climate finance right now, that I think many of us are very skeptical about the ways that this is counted, but the fact that it now includes all MDB money, which includes flows from developing countries as well, and the way that this entire goal was set forth with developed countries taking the lead rather than firmly recognizing the climate finance obligation that has existed and continues to exist for developed countries to provide climate finance to developing countries. That when we take all of this into account, it doesn't seem like $300 billion by 2035 is a goal. It seems like it's something that is frankly on the trajectory of what's already being offered. So when we haven't seen this ratcheting up of ambition, when within this broader context of the Paris Agreement, where we know that that was part of the premise. The premise was that we would be responsive to these various processes throughout the coming years so that we could stay on track to meet and limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, that there is a sense that something has fundamentally broken down, a sense that we have not actually created a process that's working to enable developing countries to fulfill the ambitions that we're expecting to see in their nationally determined contributions within the coming months. And so as the women and gender constituency, as folks that were engaging in these years of technical expert dialogues, in these meetings of the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal, making submission after submission, detailing the principles and the demands that we have for true quality climate finance, we are trying to figure out how we continue to work within the existing UNFCCC climate finance structure to look at how climate finance that is being given is operationalized through the Adaptation Fund, for example, which is still deeply underfunded, as well as the Green Climate Fund, as well as the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, so that when there is an influx of money, we can point to these mechanisms that should be delivering finance in a better way, especially in comparison to existing mechanisms such as the MDBs. But we're also needing to have this collective conversation, which is why I'm so glad to be in part of this conversation today, around how do we continue to find ways to scale up the finance, because what's been offered is not going to deliver the climate ambition that we need in this particular moment. Back over to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for drilling that down a little bit because I think that, and I'm gonna come back to you with a few more specific questions on it because at the moment it's a very much amorphous big goal, 300 billion. Is this enough? What does it mean? But I think that we really need to drill down how this doesn't move us forward and what actually could, if there are ways that we can, again, where do we go from here? Gina, I know you were in the room in the front of of the protests and the reactions of civil society when this text, the first version of this, what ended up being adopted and with a few changes, text was dropped, and there was obviously a lot of anger and frustration in the room about what this meant and what it looked like. And I think that there had been a number of other pieces in terms of process and what it looks like to actually get an outcome in this process at this point that that folks were reflecting on as a reflection of where this process is broken. And this is not new to us. You know, we had in our conversation before going to COP that we recognized that we were shifting farther and farther away from the promises of the Paris Agreement and what this process could deliver, not just around finance, but obviously from the start of this week, there was deep concerns around decisions that were made on Article 6 and the way in which that kind of um, baked in essentially uh, really concerning potential false solutions or harms against human rights that folks have been raising their voices on for a while now. So I just wanted to ask you, Gina, to share a little bit about what that final day was like, what the feelings were among civil society, and what is your sense around how people are thinking of how we move forward from here, essentially.
Hi, thank you so much. And indeed, I think that the last day was a day where you could see all what is COP about in just one single day, and that comes from the joke and the agreements that happen under the table, happening from countries, from developed countries, and at the same time, the power that is rising from the different movements. On the first point, for us as civil society, and this is just how you see as well the beauty as well of the different movements coming together and to understanding that this is something beyond an individual or an organizational agenda, even a constituency agenda, but how this is about all the people, how this is about of all the communities that we are home to, and that by having an unifying call is saying and shouting it very loudly and very clearly that no deal was better than a bad deal. And this kind of understanding and following how history has been shaped throughout the years, how institutions have been shaped throughout the years. And this is just an example of, for example, if we go and make a zoom into institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, these institutions were basically done or formed after the World War during a period of time where Africa was still colonized, during a period of time where those that remain in the power and those that remain exercising the vote and the vetoes in those institutions still have the power, and such institutions have not changed. And that's why for us, this was such an important moment in which we said, hey, it is for us either better just to not have the deal right now, but to have it in a good way so that we can shape it for what is going to come in the next years. Because at the end of the day, we could have gotten a little bit of language perhaps on the gender item or on others items, but how are we going to really implement that, and how are we going to implement that as well, seeing that the next round of NDCs to be updated, the deadline is next year, and the conversations of just transitions are popping and firing up, but how are we really going to finance and fund those transitions? So that's why for us as civil society, as movement, that's what's very clear. And we could see that really happening in how in seconds people could get together to mobilize, organize, create manifestations, address the media, present that clarity, present that political, that interpretations, no, on how the overall feeling that was as well in the rooms and among activists and advocates, how it is enough. It is enough from the global north to be the one always coming with that supremacist model or that supremacist narrative of it's only our narrative, it's only our interpretation, it's only our way to do stuff, and that's how we are going to be shaping the conversation. And that was a huge backlash, a huge pushback from civil society saying, no, 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 this is not like that. We have been hearing this process for the last as well 30 years. We come here from our expertise based on the knowledge, but also based on our experiences and also our interpretations, and also how we are advocating and how we are moving forward. This convention is also very valid. So this is something that we remained pushing until the end. Still, I think that the frustration, I think that the anger is still going to be there, and this is something that is not going to, let's say, just fly away with the wind, but how that all that anger and how all that frustration and how all those feelings are actually going to move towards getting more united as a movement, as strengthening as well our collective work. something that is going to be connected. And I think that we hope as well to see the difference is in between the presidencies as well that we are moving. We are just ending up with a presidency that was not really the most transparent, a presidency that was having that approach of take it or leave it, a presidency that was not prioritizing human rights, and that it's a clear example of the NCQG document where we do not see any mention of rights. So now the new presidency with Brazil, it gives us a little bit of a new door that is opening in many different angles. On one side, it is the very first time for the last 3 years that as civil society advocates and activists, we are going to have this conversation with people on the streets, with people from the movements. We are going to get into those conversations that move beyond that COP30 or COP29 or even the COP's agendas, but are really speaking to the most deepest needs, dreams, imaginaries, and hopes from the people. So that is a conversation that has already started already. In the last conferences also took place in Baku and will keep on going throughout the year. And this is what at the end of the day is going to be part of the goal. You know, it's going to be part of how we can then keep on shaping that vision of a just, popular, and an urgent fight and vision towards those transitions that we are seeing, as well by analyzing and reflecting very critically on that same economic model that keeps on perpetuating the same traps that we have seen that have happened in this COP. And I can leave it there.
Thank you for that, Gina. Oh, and I realized I forgot to spotlight you there. Apologies for that. I'm actually going to go to Nada in a minute because I would like to talk to you, Nada, about this piece on what has been a super limited voice for people's movements and organizing in the last few COPs, and the ways in which we have tried as civil society to create that space and what the possibilities are going forward, given the amazing intervention you did in the People's Plenary. But I'm going to quickly come back to you, Tara, to build off of what Gina shared and what folks who were maybe watching those final days of COP saw was this big clarion call for no deal is better than a bad deal. And I think that, you know, in the scope of an everyday person looking at how much is being kind of put forward to climate finance. 300 billion is not nothing, you know, it's a number. And so what about this, as you've already said, is not necessarily a goal, but I think for us as a constituency, there was real concern about, as you said, the harm baked into this deal that actually doesn't move us forward, even as we understand in being in a space of deep scarcity where we absolutely need finance. So what are the elements that you could speak to that leads us to a conclusion that there's potential harm in this deal that could have been avoided in a more enhanced deal? And then also our focus on public finance as part of this. What is the reality of this 300 billion that will likely be public finance, and why do we contend that public finance is so critical, particularly to resources getting to the front lines and supporting women and girls climate action on the ground? And maybe a final question, because I know that Leanna, on behalf of the WGC, our dear colleague Leanna Shalatek, gave a pretty masterclass presentation during the open dialogue on the, you know, where it's possible, because I think there's a lot of cynicism that's not untrue about how difficult it already has been to reach the 100 billion that we have set for ourselves so far, the real limit of commitments of public finance that have been made, and sort of this understanding that what we're asking for is impossible, essentially, that the demand on public finance is a demand where that money is not available. And I feel like we have an assessment that's a misunderstanding of how we could generate public finance. So what are your broad thoughts on that very large question that I just asked?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. So first of all, yeah, what was the harm in accepting this deal? Uh, I think there was a sense that by walking away, we still have the Paris Agreement. we still have the convention, we still have this obligation to provide climate finance, and that there might have been an opportunity to really push for what was crucial and that was not outlined in this deal, and that is the public provision of climate finance. So within this broader goal, we did not have the declaration by developed countries of what proportion of this would be directly provided and what would be provided also in the terms of grants. And the calls that we were hearing throughout this year of this process working towards the NCQG from developing countries were for $1 trillion to $1.3 trillion. And to think about that primarily or equivalent to grant provision. So to think about a key core that would be provided in grants or grant equivalency of at least $1 trillion, which was something that we were echoing as civil society as part of a larger $5 trillion call, recognizing these deep historical injustices. And as Gina was talking, we have to recognize these systemic patterns, and the reason that grant finance is so imperative is because we have climate action that is being constantly undermined by existing debt service, where in so many places the investments in climate resilience and in climate action are being drastically overspent by not even just debt service, but interest payments on existing debt, where there's a lack of investment in health and education and these key pillars of climate resilience. And where we know that grant finance is so imperative, particularly for adaptation, where there is not a profit motive, and for loss and damage in order to truly address these issues. So the idea was to truly demand this core of publicly provided finance, and to know what proportion of it could be in grants, and we don't have any of that now, which is part of why this was such a bad deal. And I think that speaks particularly to this second question around public finance and the imperative of public finance, particularly in areas such as adaptation and loss and damage, because of the ability of public finance to provide that grant-based finance that is the moral imperative at this point in the climate crisis, and that is also what is most effective in ensuring that we are actually addressing the climate crisis without exacerbating all of these economic and social inequalities that undermine climate resilience at the same time. And this question of, is there enough public finance, that we're constantly hearing developed countries say, no, there's not, no, we have to bring in the private sector. That's actually a deeply disingenuous answer when you actually look at the flows of public finance and the investments that have been made. We saw trillions of dollars unlocked during the time of emergency, during the pandemic. This is a climate emergency now. We continue to see trillions of dollars, such as $2.4 trillion this past year, spent on global military spending. And when you actually are able to break down and look at the availability of public finance with fair and progressive taxation, it's very easy to actually get to the trillions of dollars that are demanded. And that's something that this presentation, that the Women and Gender constituency represented by Liana Shalatek was able to share at COP. Unfortunately, only 15 parties were in the room for that conversation. Some of that other data that we were really showing, this roadmap to get to the trillions of dollars, shows that this entire idea of leveraging public finance in order to get private finance constantly underperforms. There's this idea that with a little bit of public finance invested in the right ways, that we can unlock magnitudes more of private finance. And that's just not true when you look at the data, that you're often putting in $1 and getting pennies on the dollar when it comes to these uh, financial innovations or so-called innovations. The real innovation at this point would be providing grant-based finance directly to the solutions that we know are proven to work, including more accessible and streamlined grant-based finance directly to communities and grassroots groups. But that's not considered innovation in these conversations, unfortunately. There's always this idea that we can use some sort of calculations and algorithms to unlock magical amounts of private sector money. And the history continues to show time and time again how that doesn't work. The same way that we have the history of PPPs not actually delivering effectively for the infrastructure projects that they're so often developed around. So we need to trust the history. We need to actually trust the data rather than trust the leaders that are using this as an excuse, not a reason, but a true excuse for not fulfilling their climate finance obligations.
Thank you, Tara, for answering that multitude of question in multitude. I very much appreciate the grounding of what it is that we are asking for, what are we being challenged around. And I speak to this, I'm reflecting on the fact that I was part of a number of conversations at COP where there is a feeling of truly genuine commitment to gender responsive climate finance, that folks want to and understand that that their current finance mechanisms are not fit for purpose. Money is not reaching where it needs to go. I heard that from everything from the finance mechanisms to folks working in private sector, and that we need particular forms and channels of finance through women's funds, environmental funds to reach where money needs to go. But I feel like those conversations are siloed in spaces and not connected to then what we see in this outcome and what is potentially encapsulated in terms of where we're expecting money to flow to. And all of a sudden, all of those barriers that we seem to understand in the small conversations around how we make finance more accessible, they kind of float away when it comes to what the goal and how it's encapsulated looks like. So thank you for drilling down for us again the real specificity of why using the current system and expecting different results is not an effective strategy for climate action. I want to move to Nada and this question of um, where we are seeing the last three COPs have been particularly difficult in terms of mobilizing civil society and a strong movement voice, and having to do that sort of inside the space. And there's hope that over the next year, we're able to build again broad movement, not to be in the space of COP, but to be really driving agendas that inform what happens at a COP, which have been quite difficult. We've been in spaces where we've been very concerned about um, uh, uh, speaking out and being critical and what the ramifications of that would be. One of the manifestations of a number of different COPs where civil society voice feels like it's been muted or tampered down has been a collective people's plenary that was created to give space for telling the truth in the space and in the process. I wanted to ask you what your experience was of participating in and being in the People's Plenary, and how that, where you're feeling we need to be moving next as we continue to engage in this space as feminists, as advocates, how we do that kind of broader mobilization. So over to you, Nada.
Thank you so much first for inviting me and for the question. Um, I think so. I'm gonna speak first about my experience with the People's Plenary, which for me was the first, and kind of reflecting and connecting it to this larger shrinking of civic space, which I think particularly in my background, I'm used to navigating, but like particularly this one, even though in our region this is something that's familiar, we felt it even more. We felt the frustration and the constraints more. So first on the People's Plenary, as for the first time, like being a part of it, um, I really felt this kind of gap between what you see in the negotiation rooms and that power struggle and that attempt to divide the global south among those like world leaders, negotiators, and so on, versus the civil society and the kind of unity you see there. And for me, that particular moment was really empowering, and to feel that kind of, you know, strength in our numbers and our movement and that shared collective goal and vision kind of echo off of each other is motivating, and made me think, which I think was very critical at the end of COP, when everybody is so demotivated, when everything was happening in very untransparent ways, behind closed doors, waiting, for the 11th hour to have those decisions released, and kind of just preparing and building that. And having that space, I think, is really important because, somebody afterwards asked me, like, what would you say? And I'm like, oh, I was so frustrated and angry at that time. And it's just that, to be honest, like, I'm putting my bets on the people. And I think having those kinds of spaces are so important for reminding us that, it is true that, civil society, the collective, the mass people have broken down systems that haven't worked for us before. We've done it before and we can do it again. And we already in those spaces, um we've seen that coming alive. And I think what's so important moving on and what we can learn for that is that, and it's been emphasized, and I think particularly in this people's plenary, is that, climate change is a backdrop or a fundamental core connected to so many different issues and so many different flaws in our system that are perpetuating inequality, that are enabling injustices, that are targeting and systemically trying to disempower the global south to prevent this kind of this movement building and this reclaiming of like power and redistribution of wealth that was built on the global south. And for me, what was really highlighted is that we need to take COP and we need to take this as like one kind of cornerstone or one building block of a larger movement, and making sure that we're connecting to all these different systems and symptoms of injustice. So whether it comes to our international economic system or international finance architecture, our international policy system, how is that connected also to our international legal system? How is that connected to the wars that are happening, the arms trade, the energy trade? So also our trade systems, and how can we make sure that also that human rights and the different streams of human rights movements, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's indigenous rights, whether it's gender justice, what is an attack on one system will impact another and will reinforce and allow this to happen to another group or to another stream of issues, whether it's finance, whether it's civic space. And I think something that before going to COP, I was like, we've had it in Egypt, we've had it in UAE with kind of similar circumstances. And somebody was telling me, like, this is such a questionable, like, kind of space to have COP. And I didn't honestly really process it until I was there, until even us who are from such like limited spaces felt the suffocation, felt like the inability to really build and say and be critical where we needed to be critical. And we saw actually in that the UNFCCC was also enabling this. And what role are they playing in allowing this to happen? There are certain actions we weren't allowed to show faces, but in other actions we were. So what is this space serving then? Who is it serving? What kind of imbalance of powers are they also reproducing? Which are all, I think, questions again into the climate movement needs to be in connection and synergy with all these different movements. And we have to like work together to make sure that this is happening simultaneously, because decisions taken at the IMF, at the World Bank, at CSW, at all these different processes, they ultimately feed into each other. And like the space, the UNFCCC climate, discourse tries to like silo it, tries to divide it, tries to make it like They're not, you know, related, but they inherently are. They're inherently part of this larger system that enables, reproduces, disenables, disempowers. And this is what I think moving forward to Belém, I'm afraid to be very confident, be like, yeah, Belém will be so much better because I've also like heard concerns about like having the same cycle in Belém, like the space in Belém, it's the middle of the Amazon. And yes, it's meant to be, okay, look, we are trying to connect with the environment, but at the same time, what are they doing to the environment, to the indigenous people there, to the local communities there to build the space? And we need to be mindful of maybe they're framing themselves for a particular reason in that. So I think we have to be really strategic and really capitalize on these connections because so many different organizations, people work in different streams and how we can better build those synergies and start thinking about now. And I think something that was echoed in the People's Plenary a lot is that, you know, we cannot have climate justice without human rights. We cannot have it without addressing war and genocide. And like as Tara has mentioned, as Gina has mentioned, these are historical things. They're not new. They're not produced in vacuums. And we need to be mindful of addressing how can we get to the core of what's really causing the issue and making sure that we're working in unity against that. And I think that's what I'm putting my bets on and what I want to focus on moving forward is how can we together build again like on this because there's that potential to like have this like global movement to dismantle the system because we know it's a failing system. We know it's a system that's not serving us, that is benefiting from our own suffering, from our own disparities and inequalities. So and the UNFCCC is one space to be able to connect that to something that's fundamental, which is, our environmental and climate health and well-being. So how can we use it to bring back these synergies and connections and make sure that it is grounded and fighting that attempt to kind of create divisions and silos and starting from now and starting from also making sure that these different movements are mainstream in climate, but also that climate is mainstream in different movements as well. Yeah, thank you for this.
Thank you for that, Nada. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. You raised so many really interesting points, and I think it's both such a reflection on how multilaterals themselves talk a good talk about coherence, but then we see how each space is really being used for, countries' own national interests, protected trade agreements, interests, and there's a complete backlash against any actual coherence in terms of recognizing decisions made across different spaces and so that's deeply resonant. It's also my experience of also engaging across many multilateral spaces is for better or for worse. I do think one very positive outcome of the COP process is that it has generated a deep space for collective mobilizing and solidarity amongst civil society. I would say that in that space, there is more collective action that happens across youth, trade unions, indigenous peoples organizations, climate justice organizations, feminist organizations than I see visible in any other multilateral space. And so I think that that's both a symptom of injustice and a symptom of the systemic nature of which we're all seeing and understanding the climate crisis to be, and a deep need for really capturing and trying to hold that power. But I think that there is something potentially very positive about that in terms of how we are able to build going forward, and what is going to be necessary in terms of making these deep linkages. Something I think as feminists, as women's rights activists, we need to be paying specific attention to in this moment is that I have never heard a more vocal demand for COP reform than there is right now. And COP reform and saying this process is unjust and needs to be changed is not new, Movements have been saying that for decades. But what's different now is the UNFCCC for a long time, the people in charge of the process themselves have said this process has become unsustainable in the way that we're currently hosting it. That's already been something that's under discussion. And, major players in upholding the current system are now saying that the COP itself needs to be reformed. I think there's opportunity in that conversation, but there's also opportunity for it to be a harmful decision because I think that there are many who want to reform the process to give more power to those who already have an outsized voice in what happens and what the outcomes are. But there are conversations about the need to lean in more heavily to demanding a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, for example, and what the possibilities are there. We've internally been talking about if we're thinking about this need for public finance, if that's our goal, where can we be leaning into the UN tax convention and thinking about tax justice as both a potential exacerbator of inequalities and a potential exacerbator of conflict and harm if done improperly, or an opportunity to think through a taxation system that's based on progressive feminist values that could actually work in enabling stronger public finance. So I think this moment of where we're connected as movements and this deeper conversation of how we reform the process is something we should all really be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months and years as we see how this manifests itself in broader multilateralism. I want to shift us just a little bit to, we put out a statement as the Women and Gender constituency, sharing that there was a renewed 10-year action or work plan, sorry, a 10-year renewal of the Lima Work Program on Gender, which for all intents and purposes, we do consider a win, particularly given the fight that we had to maintain language in that decision. Very much cognizant of the fact that a win within the system with no finance and no justice is difficult to call a win. But Mishi, I would love to invite you in to share a little bit with those who maybe weren't at COP, what happened around the renewal of the Gender Action Plan, of the Lima Work Program on Gender, and what were some of the fights? What did that look like? And what's next coming up?
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you for that. But before that, I was really itchy to just add my sense on like what happened like overall in terms of the reforming the UN CCC system as well. Just to echo what Gina said in that, I said like the frustration on the last day, it wasn't just coming from civil society. And I think for the first time, we also see parties extremely frustrated of the process as well, especially in the last 2 days in the day. The document that were shared, there was no formal consultation. We have had the presidency just consulting the group that he wanted to consult. And on the last day, literally the OASIS and LDC, the OASIS issued a statement and complaining that their group is not being consulted because the president appeared to have been focusing consultation to those who are supposed to give money and not those who, quote unquote, are supposed to receive money. So in this case, prioritizing consultation, the groups like EU and EUS in expense of like LDC and OASIS, which caused a lot of frustration as well. And and we have seen until the end, for example, in the final hours of 3 a.m., close to 4 a.m., India still feeling that their voices are not being heard when it comes to how multilateral bank has been pushed in the decision. So there was a critical discomfort among all of us from parties, and we have spent the closing plenary started at the first part of the closing plenary started around 8 p.m. and we were in the room until 4, and part of it parties started like caucusing and starting consultation there, on which every government have indicated that that is not how the multilateral process needs to run. The document need to be shared. There needs to be a place where all parties can hear their views. So that, I think that that feeling that this needs to change. It's feeling that is growing. And I think critical to that is also the role of presidency, because there was a frustration that the president is supposed to facilitate discussion and not presidents to make decision on behalf of countries. That is not the role of the presidency. So I just want to share that. And I think part of that frustration as well when it comes to gender, we have a document released, I think, day before and then day after. There was no formal negotiations, and we received the L document few minutes before the closing plenary. So we knew by that time that there was an agreement, because in the last day, really, I think fairly can say during the second week, after a few days, it became the game of like wait and see and run to the negotiator to ask them like what is happening in the closed door. And most of the government, if you're not a leading negotiator for the bloc, like most of them don't have as much information the same as we do. But we did end up seeing in the final, when the just before the gender decision was adopted, there was a circulated a text that there will be adjustment to the decision requested by Russia, and that is how it was adopted. So just to take you back, we went to Bonn after the we went to Bonn this year with a clear assessment of what WGC wanted to see in the renewal work program. And that was done because, unlike previous year, this year we did take time to consult a number of governments and group to contribute to our collective submission, was due March this year. And we wanted to have a feeling of where governments are, where civil society are, what is the aspiration and ambition, what has worked for the current work program and gap, and what has not worked. So out of that consultation, we set our recommendation. We have set the gap, and we set our recommendation based on the gap that we have seen. So we went to the SB with those ideas of what the new work program has been. We left SB quite disappointed and frustrated because parties didn't make progress with the work program, and based on the mandate that was given this year was supposed to be adoption of both the work program and action plan. So coming of the SPs with parties not even agreeing on the work program, we knew that the likelihood of having an action plan for this year is almost minimal. But parties has set their red lines quite openly in the SP, and there was no effort to bring them together. So post SB, the Women and Gender Constituency and all of us really tried to engage parties in bilateral to assess whether there is any progress in them talking to each other and bridging the gap on the four red lines that they have set. And we, by September, we were deeply concerned because most parties did indicated to us that there was no deliberate effort that have been made to engage parties. And we, by that time, we've received a number of letters from the presidents outlining their priorities, and gender was not one of them. So we were deeply concerned that there was no political leadership, and if the efforts will not be made for parties to bridge their gap on their red lines, then the chances are we might not have a decision. Hence, the WGC collectively with members did write public letter to the presidents demanding the presidents to prioritize gender and really give them a clear kind of call that they need to engage the party and they need to prepare themselves to provide leadership so that we can have gender. And we said it quite clearly that we cannot afford to leave Baku without a decision. So we sort of like it wasn't an ask if you can have a decision, but rather telling them that we want a decision this year. And we did the same as we engaged them in pre-COP in Baku, which was held in October. So fast forward when we get to Baku, unfortunately, the first week was hugely spent with all governments trying to again put their red lines on the table. And it was unfortunately and painful to see that there is sort of like organized way in which some of the government they are determined to roll back some of the the rights of women in all our diversities and pushing us to very basic minimum, but also in the positive side, we have also witnessed government that also standing quite firm to say, at very least, the existing Lima work program should be a benchmark, and we should not have a rollback in the rights, nor should we have a weaker gender action plan. So after the closure of week one, without any effort to breach the red lines, the decision was forwarded to the co-presidency, and then it was taken over by the presidency. And to most of us who have been in the process, we strongly believe that that would not be possible if it wasn't for pressure of the feminists to tell the COP that we are watching you, and this has to, like we want you to provide this leadership and to lead. Part of that is comes with the complexities of those meetings being in a closed room that we didn't have access to, but we have worked quite closely with some of the negotiators for us to be able to have sort of like a sense of what is happening in the consultation. So at the end, I think it was like around 3 in the morning or 2 when the gender decision was formally adopted, and it granted us a 10-year work program. And just to say, by the beginning of this year, like there was very few or no pathways that were speaking 10 years work program. That was one of the asks that we put. We're going to the SP, and we end up, and even when we're in the when we were in Baku, still some of the government didn't see themselves committing to 10 years. So getting all parties to agree in 10 years, a long-term work program, like to really give us an opportunity to have an extended mandate and to have extended mandate to deliver this work program, of course, with a midterm review in 2029. We also have in this gender, of course, there was a lot of discussion on how the data language has been framed. With some of the parties specifically didn't want the use of gender disaggregated data, and they want sex disaggregated data, but our collective work with allies, government in the room, we didn't manage to get how do you call it? A compromise of gender and age disaggregated data, which also like it's bringing in the aspect of gender, and in addition of generational equity, which is also a good thing. So it was centered there as well, and that is key of what we have received from the decisions. Of course, there was a part of the bigger tension was climate finance. So the decision has a language which recognizes the need of climate finance and gender responsive financing in general, especially to women's rights organizations, which is also one of the positive that comes from the gap. And of course, issues around capacity building and need to scale up capacity building, representation has been articulated in the work plan, issues around coherence, of course, feminists and other parties want clarity on, for example, integration within the Rio Convention, but at least we get the broader language on how we can, how the work will be integrated within the wider UN, but also being tied into the gender action, the UN. And I think last, which is critical to us, as I've said initially, that the decision this year is supposed to be for the work program and action plan. So we did get quite a clear roadmap on how the work agenda action plan will be developed. And this is also one of the feminist asks, because we feel that the agenda action plan needs to be clearly articulated to address the gap. So it shouldn't just be a political process, but should be a technical process, and that has been integrated. And we're looking forward as we start, as we end this year, we are looking forward to categorically engage the was a call for submission, which is due in March. So we are also inviting all the feminists, women and gender. We'll be coordinating our collective input on how the next gap should look like. And we are standing ready to engage and support, to engage the Secretariat, but also engage with parties to make sure that we have the Gender Action Plan to be adopted in next year in Belém, which is fit for purpose, ambitious, and really take us forward in making sure that we have gender responsive climate action. Back to you, Bridget.
Thank you for that, Mishi, and thank you for the deep overview of what's happening. And maybe just to add in terms of summaries, I think that while we sit within a system that we've clearly just articulated as deeply flawed and deeply unjust and have concerns around the trajectory of where finance is going, I think part of why we find it really critical to maintain, of course, for the sake of maintaining, really hard fought gains on gender equality and human rights in this process, to making sure there's no rollbacks around that, but to having this commitment to a 10-year work program and hopefully then its further action plan is really about an opportunity for coherence and an opportunity to do advocacy at the national level, even where the multilateral process is fracturing. We think that this is a really important coupling to the advocacy that we feel like where change really happens at the grassroots level, at the local level, at the national level. Things like the Lima Work Program on gender and then its corresponding gender action plan give us additional tools for advocacy, for pushing as countries develop their nationally determined contributions, that they are thinking about processes that are inclusive of women's organizations, of grassroots women's organizations, and making sure that this is a part of the process and the outcomes that lead to the pieces of text that they are bringing into the global policy space itself. And, you know, one of the realities that we're facing in every multilateral space is a growing, coordinated, and financed anti-gender movement of countries that are being very vocal and visible about categorizing a number of progressive actions as gender ideology. The president, my own incoming president, campaigned on defeating the gender ideology. So I think that this space is only going to become harder in a way in which we are trying to push a more expansive and diverse understanding of equality and justice and what that looks like. The ground on which we're walking is very difficult and becoming more tenuous. And so I think it was really important that we establish this long-term framing for how climate action should be developed. And again, it's not our assessment that that in and of itself is what transforms gender inequalities on the ground, but that it's a really important advocacy tool for us to have as we then try to push governments at national level in terms of how they're developing their policies and what it looks like. I'm going to just ask one other colleague, Gina, I was hoping I could come back to you because I think as part of our push for bringing in a strong feminist analysis into the climate space, one of the other areas that feels like a win, even though procedurally it wasn't a win, was in the work that women's rights organizations, feminists, and advocates have been doing to reframe the conversation around just transition into a much more systemic and feminist conversation. And so I think that this is also an entry point for us to bring a lens that's not just about how do we ensure gender equality and outcomes, but how do we bring a feminist lens, an analysis of feminist climate justice into the process. So maybe to kind of, and then for all of the rest, for Mishi and Tara and Nada, to be thinking about anything else you'd want to say before we conclude as a reflection on COP. But Gina, maybe I can turn to you to talk a little bit about the care work in the Just Transition Working Group.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I think I will start by saying that these type of spaces are always very flooded with that narrative of scarcity, a narrative that we saw that has been put forward as how there is no climate finance or enough climate finance or the funding are not there, and how this is the scarcity of resources. Also something that we discussed last time. However, something that the work of feminists has been shaping, uplifting, and making very clear is that our imaginaries and our solutions are not scarce, and on the contrary, they are completely abundant. And this is something that we are also pushing forward in all the analysis, in all the reflections, and the political work that we are also advancing on, particularly the one on the Just Transition Working Group. In the Just Transition conversations, we are moving away of what the constraints of this convention or the multilateral space has been shaping, but also opening and broadening the conversation to what is happening in other different corners, such as, for example, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia Pacific, but also interconnecting with what has this to do with other conversations that are going to be very prominent, such as, for example, the establishment of a UN tax convention, or why it is important, for example, to start talking about as well trade agreements. No, when we see as well the rise of the need of those transitional minerals that are being said by the World Bank that we are going to be needing 500% more of those materials that are going to come again from the south. So how this is for us as well a critical moment to put a halt on what can be the reproduction of the same capitalist, colonial, extractivist, and patriarchal model, which is only being discussed with a green costume. And these conversations are going to go very much in line with other conversations when we start hearing, for example, there was a big summit that happened in Cuba these years, kind of bringing up again the conversation on the new economic order, no, in the international new economic order, in the new political order, like what are the conversations that are happening as well beyond this convention, a conversation that also needs to interconnect those calls that many feminists have been calling out since decades for demilitarization. What are we funding? Are we funding those systems of murder, debt, and destructions, or are we really moving into funding a life that is worth living, a life that is in dignity for all, that does not understand class, does not understand race, ethnicity, but really comes from that intersectional lens to bring the diversity of the multiple realities that are aiming as well to benefit and to rise up from all from these different processes. So in the Just Transition conversation, we are interconnecting those elements that we have been mentioning here, not only with a very bold and strong human rights-based approach that is aiming to guarantee procedural justice, but at the same time, what is this? What does this has to do with bigger conversations on how we are transforming a normalized economic system that keeps on plundering the earth, as the same economic system that has been dealing with those agreements under the table, and that at the same time is the same system that is fueling genocides. And this is how we are going to get into that connection, into that conversation. That is also kind of making as well, or is being evidence during those last days at COP, where we saw a huge call for that international solidarity, for that international work, whereas when we are connecting as well our struggles, not only just from the locals perspective, but how as well through that regional conversation that we are having, particularly as well as the Women and Gender Constituency, having these regional conversations already since some years, how this is going to shape and strengthen our collective work, and understand that as we share that colonial past, as we share that history of ecological debt that has been put in our territories, we also share that vision for those futures. We also share that movement that is going to come us to rise and to end and shape and transform all those systemic inequalities. So this is something that we have been very categorically on calling it out, not just as a corporate energy transition, but how this concept, how this understanding of just transition needs to be grounded on care, on systems of care that shape the social infrastructure that are needed, so that we are not continuing to rely on one of the biggest subsidies in history, which is the unvalued, unpaid, and unrecognized care and domestic work that is sustaining and is allowing other ways of work, because we are not having yet those conversations. And these are conversations that are not only needed with the governments, but are conversations that need to move beyond that, that also need to reach out our allies, that need to reach out other constituencies or other movements to understand better why actually is the call for not having more loans that are going to just increase austerity measures that at the end of the day are again women in all the diversity, the buffer of these fiscal limitations in the space. So this is something that we are working very strongly to make those connections, working out as well strongly on the connections on when we call about transitions, when we call as well about other modes or the models that are possible, is not about how we are moving to electrify our consumption and our production patterns, but how we are really moving into those policies of sufficiency of what is needed, understanding that we are operating under certain planetary boundaries which we have already surpassed 6 out of 9. So which are those systems, which are those industries that we need to degrow, which are those models that we need to really put an end on the story, in sense of which are those that are promoting harm instead of those livelihoods and those futures, feminist futures that we want to see. So that is part of the conversation, and that is part as well of what is going to be shaped along the upcoming years, and also in a very transversal way in all the work that the Women and Gender constituency is going to be advancing. How are we going to be resonated within, but also having a conversation with all the different discussions that are happening outside. Again, I think that this next year there are going to be a lot of different conversations important for us in terms of tax, in terms of debt, and also to bring as well the aspect of trade and keep on calling countries accountable and calling them out so that they are not continuing to be complicit. This international complicity on murder has to end now. That international complicity on genocide has to end now. And this is not just for one territory, this is for a collective liberation. And I think that we need to move stronger with that call. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you so much for that, Gina. And I think that, it's this deep, deep analysis, the way that it manifests in these spaces is through, so many dialogues with parties, with negotiators to try to reframe their understanding of just transition. And I think some of this work is so invisible in terms of what then is seen outside of the space, but it's really critical advocacy that even just the fact that there was the word care in a text that almost was decided that did go to a procedural decision in the end, but the amount of effort and work that goes behind really trying to shift the system through language, knowing that and through decisions, which we know is not the only way that change happens, but is a really important part of narrative shift. And I just want to commend all of the folks that were in the COP space that continue to do this work, because even if the impact isn't seen visibly in the text and the decisions themselves, it is impacting the people who are working on it. It is reframing their thinking. It is challenging their understandings of a just transition. And that in and of itself is really important and necessary. I know that folks are leaving and grateful to you to coming and joining and listening to this conversation. Shout out to anyone who's on the call who was also at COP, who is also behind all of this work and did such amazing analysis, advocacy, and we know that you all have deep insights that you would also be able to share on what happened. Just to close us out, I wanted to offer the floor to any of my colleagues, to Nada, to Tara, to Mishi, or Gina, for any closing thoughts that you might have had that you didn't get to say. Mishi, please close us out.
So oh, just to share, I think some of the things that I have seen and I think we need to do better next year. I think there is a need for us to make our feminist analysis a household analysis, and to make it popular and to make it visible, and to really claim that feminist knowledge and feminist expertise. We have seen at COP, we went to this COP with a team of experts in all agenda items. But so, for example, it's so obvious that when media reach to us, they'll just reach to us in relation to gender. Like they don't engage us. Like, what is your expert? Can we get, for example, somebody from WGC or from WEDO or from Feminist to speak on the NCQG or on the just transition, etc. While we have quite a deep knowledge and analysis on how all these agenda items need to be. So at least for my personal reflections and call, we need to be intentional to dedicate resources in terms of like human resource capacities and time to make our household public. I mean, to make our analysis public in the household analysis. And then what also left with me is also there is a lot of work that we need to do at country level in our communities. We have seen, I've been in a feminist in the room when we hear our government talk, like we can all say like that is not reflection of who we are as people or as feminists in that country. And we cannot always to engage our government when we see them at the COP. So it was such that a reflection that this conversation need to happen at country level. We need to work with our government if we have to get a progressive decision and to have a negotiator who really understand our issue. So it was just a call for all of us to work collectively, not to wait when we have like 1 week before COP. But now that we are back, how do we build a relationship? How do we engage? And how do we make sure that at the end of the day, our government speaks and defends ambition and aspiration of women and feminists in their country, and not just their view based on what they best understand. So that was to my takeaway on the work that we need to do moving forward. Back to Bridget.
And I'll just build off that in one sentence. Is connecting also the conversation we had before COP. I think also we need to mainstream this idea that COP is not the end goal, but to use it as an instrument to achieve our goal, and to think about throughout the year what we need to do on a national, local, regional level, and then use COP to meet what we want to do. So building off of what Mishi said, which I 100% agree with.
Wonderful. Those were both a clear call to action and an important reframing of the work that we do and why we do it that feel perfect for how we round out this conversation. This is the first of many. All we do is chat, and the idea that I think actually, Mishi, part of why we started doing these series is because we were having a lot of these conversations quite internally, and we want to create more pathways and more opportunities to share these thoughts and these ideas and this analysis in a more public way. And obviously, this is just one of many ways that we're going to be trying to do that over the coming months. But deep gratitude, closing in deep gratitude to everyone who was at COP, everyone who's supporting on the sidelines, uplifting, sharing information that was shared over social media, giving support where needed when we had demands and statements that were written, and to everyone who was on the ground on site holding the line as feminists for a stronger, more just outcome in that process. Thank you to you, and wishing you some rest now. Bye, y'all.
Can I say one small thing,
Oh,
Bridget?
it was a perfect ending, Mishi. No, I'm kidding. Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I think we started COP analysis and we say like this is the COP that we are going to hold the line, and it was quite powerful to see by the end of the COP like everyone from the civil society just saying that we are holding a line, and that was quite a powerful leadership from WDC and the team that have worked and they called that. So thank you so much. I just wanted to share that. It was a shared. We end up being a shared analysis that we are holding the line.
Yes, and as Wambui said, we are still holding that line. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.